Muy buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Marta Sañudo y soy profesora de filosofía en la Escuela de Humanidades del TEC de Monterrey y tengo el gran honor de presentar el día de hoy a nuestro invitado, Nils Roemer. El doctor Nils Roemer es el director del Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies. Él está adscrito, o ese centro está adscrito a la Universidad de Texas en Dallas. Allí se brindan seminarios para graduados, se organiza un congreso anual y programa periódicamente ciclos de conferencias, en donde además se pone a disposición de la audiencia pues, su bibliografía, sus artículos, una serie de libros que forman una biblioteca. Las áreas de investigación del doctor Roemer abarcan los campos de la historia moderna y judía, con énfasis en la historia germano-hebraica. Además, posee un interés particular en la historia cultural e intelectual. Pues con esto le damos la bienvenida al doctor Nils Roemer. Bienvenido.
Thank you, Marta. So let me just get into my talk here. All right. You see here one more time. I'm originally actually from Germany, not from Texas, but I've been heading the center for a while, but also two respective schools. So my wider field is really Holocaust studies, but I'll be focusing today on a small element of that, those that were attracted to come to the United States because of their potential benefit that they would offer in terms of their prestige. Whoa. So why am I interested in the history of refugees? I think too often we neglect to understand that the very things that we inherited have actually been created by others before us who've come from elsewhere. And that's very much true for our center. Our center was founded by Zsuzsanna Aschwart, who herself was a survivor of the Holocaust. She was born in Budapest, Hungary during the 1930s, survived the Holocaust, and then eventually fled Hungary after the failed revolution of 1956. But she's in many ways only one of many Jewish refugees who fled Europe, as well as those who came even after the war had already ended. But before we go there, we probably need to remember that the period that I'm focusing on is now largely the period from 1933 to, let's say, 1941. During this period is the time when people were still able to escape. One of the last open harbors in many ways was Lisbon. So by 41, it becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible, really, for Jews to get out of Europe, or also for Jews to find places that would, welcome them. And I'll be talking a little bit about that. But the two images that we most often associate with the Holocaust are, on the one side, images of the death camps, Auschwitz here on the left side, and on the other side, the images of the Third Reich, of the rallies of Hitler, of the SS, and so on and so forth. So outside of that, though, there's quite a history of refugees that are escaping as early as 33 and as late as 41. And some of them ultimately end up being itinerant, coming first going to England, then coming to Canada, then going to the United States, and then some of them end up also in places like Mexico. So the ones that attract a great deal of attention, obviously the most famous ones. Albert Einstein is probably the most famous German Jewish refugee that one can think of. Already at the time when he escaped in 33, he was an icon of scientific advancement. He was famous within the Weimar Republic. People collected his signatures. And he was kind of a rock star of a scientist early on. But I think, and I purposely picked this picture here as a way to say scientists were not the only ones who fled. Amongst those that escaped were also numerous artists. And so I'll be looking at both of these groups. But before we go into this, we have to ask ourselves, why is the history of Jewish scientists so important? Well, between the beginning of the 20th century in 1933, about 100 Nobel Prizes had been awarded, a total of 100 Nobel Prizes, of which Germany gained about 33. So Germany was a really advanced society at the time, getting about a third worldwide of all Nobel Prize winners. But what is interesting for us is that about a quarter of all German Nobel Prize winners were Jewish, even though they made up barely 1% of the German population. So while they were a tiny little minority, they were disproportionately overrepresented amongst the German Nobel Prize winners. Now, we can spend a little bit of time thinking about how that happened. And there are lots of theories about this. In my mind, part of the success can be explained by the simple fact that Jews accelerated in disciplines that were, about to be created. In other words, they struggled to make it in disciplines that were all established because they were gatekeepers, and they were quickly making their names with things that were novel, path-breaking. Einstein is a good example, right? For the kinds of things that he ultimately advances, there was no precedent. But we therefore come up with this illustrious list of individuals who were not just simply good scientists, but that is also important for us. Most of them were also very German and very patriotic. And the one that probably we could single out is the one in the middle. Oh, wrong button. Let me try again. Here, Fritz Haber. I'm not going to go through the biography of each one of them, but I think he's an interesting one. He played a major role in the development of chemical warfare in the World War I. So he was one of the critical scientists that allowed Germany to advance and to stay in the war, because he supplied the German army with chemical weapons, which were critical from about 1915. Remember, the First World War breaks out. Everyone is cheerful and hopeful about a quick and decisive victory. That doesn't happen. And at that point, the war becomes more and more brutal. And, Germany first, but then the other countries also follow suit by using chemical warfare on a larger scale. So in many ways, these scientists, Einstein is more the exception, are both exceptionally good at what they're doing, very patriotic German, and really fully integrated into the German society. Lots of ways. If we look at another picture here they are coming together. Famous scientists in 1921, the famous Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, about half of all the people will be displaced persons or have lost their homes in the 1930s. So in many ways, there's a very quick and very dramatic change that occurs that turns these scientists like Einstein from celebrated individuals who were well-respected university professors into refugees. And that happens almost instantaneously as soon as Hitler comes to power. When Hitler comes to power in 1933, one of the first things that his new state legislates is a law in April of 1933 that essentially takes away the opportunity of Jews to continue to be professors at universities. And so therefore it sets up this kind of precedent that they very quickly will be looking for different places, along with other Jews that are now trying to escape in the 30s early on to mostly neighboring countries. So most Jews in 33, 34, they escaped to Amsterdam or to Paris or to Brussels, in other words, neighboring European countries. Sometimes they will go to places where they have family networks, the United States and the likes. But early on, most of those that escape are escaping either for political reasons or they're hoping that they will eventually be able to return. Nobody expects this to be long-lasting. But we can see very quickly that the question is not only of getting out of Nazi Germany, which is difficult enough, tough decision to make, to leave everything behind, your home, parts of your family. The other really critical issue is where to go. And here you have like statistics about the acceptance of immigrants to the United States. You remember the lady with the torch, Liberty, very famously standing in for the welcoming attitude that the United States has had. Well, that changes very dramatically around 1924, when the US institutes new laws that are more restrictive of immigrants. And then precisely when Hitler comes to power, the numbers drop even further. So precisely at the moment when Jews would have been looking more and more for places to escape to, the numbers that the United States would be accepting are dropping even further and further. Now, coming back to our scientists, let's look at this for a moment. Why is that the case? Well, the US was economically undergoing a really difficult period during the 1930s, and largely during this poll of 1938 that is often used, they were not particularly welcoming. They were worried about the potential competition coming from immigrants. And therefore, we have famous stories that talk about the absence of places in terms of where Jews could go. One of the most famous stories that is often told is of this liner, the SS St. Louis, that left loaded with Jewish refugees, actually my hometown, Hamburg, made it all the way across the Atlantic, all the way to Cuba, with ready-made visas for all of the people on board, only then to realize that the visas were denied upon arrival. And then the question remained, where would now these refugees go? The United States denied entry, Canada denied entry, and virtually every Latin American country denied entry to them. And therefore, the St. Louis turned around, crossed again all the way back the Atlantic, and made it again all the way into Europe, only for many of these refugees that had almost escaped to end up later on in the hands of the Third Reich. There's another story just like this, the Kwanzaa. In this case, it's a ship that had left Lisbon, one of the last open harbors in 1940, carrying more than 300 passengers. Most of them were Jewish and some Americans. 10 days and one hurricane later, they arrived in New York City. The crew lowered the gangway, and once again, they were denied entry into the United States. And then the remaining people, short of the US citizens, were then meant to come to Mexico, where once again, they were not allowed to enter the country. So we have various of these stories, in other words, that make it quite obvious that finding a new home was actually quite difficult. Not so much for these. These are the most famous scientists. One of the books that came out a while ago, Hitler's Gift, kind of illustrates this point that many of the other countries benefited tremendously from the Third Reich, meaning Germany, persecuting Jews and therefore becoming home to many of these scientists. The countries that absorbed most Jewish scientists were England and then eventually the United States. The story that is most famous as far as the United States is concerned is the so-called Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb as well as rockets. This is actually not so much the Jewish scientists as much as the German scientists that they scoop up after the war. But in other words, these are exceptional individuals. They are desirable because they offer something that could be of benefit, and therefore, both early on in England as well as ultimately in the States, organizations are being created that make up lists of famous scientists that are desirable, that they are trying to get across and are trying to place into university settings. So here's the American example, the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars, that really have a list famous physicists, famous this, famous this, famous that. Now, there are a couple of things that are really interesting about this. There's an endless list of highly desirable scientists and a big country called the United States. And now this organization is trying to match these scientists with potential universities. Most of these scientists will end up in either Northeast Coast universities or in West Coast universities, not in Tennessee, not in Mississippi, not in any of the universities that are predominantly Black. There's a very clear sense that these top scientists are to be, matched up with very prestigious institutions and not to be sent, down south. And there's also the additional problem. As this organization is advertising the potential new homes to these scientists, they emphasize, this is during the 30s, right? 33, 34, 35, that America could be the new home, a country of freedom. Well, that is true, but it's a little bit different in the South. And so when they talk about some of the Southern universities, they emphasize that the United States is a country of relative freedom because of the Jim Crow laws. There are still racial laws that govern the existence of African Americans in the 1930s. So there's a very clear sense that race is not entirely absent from the placement of these. Let me move on. Neither is gender. So, up until this point, when I said scientists, almost exclusively, remember the first picture, all men. Why is that? Well, for various reasons. It was a very male-centered scientific community. Women had entered that community, but belatedly. In other words, by 33, most women had not quite yet become famous scientists, but were just about to make their career. But they were also possibly entering a male-centered scientific community in the United States. So if you look at the sampling for about 80 women who were scientists, their acceptance and support rate is far lower. In other words, Jewish female scientists were disproportionately disadvantaged in their attempt to find a new home. So, in lots of ways, unfortunately, the experience of displacement and loss of home amplifies already existing gender inequalities in many ways here. In different ways, though, and this is the other point that I'm trying to make, we should also remember that this migration does not end in 41, but it picks back up again in 45. Very famously with Operation Paperclip, where now a part of a program of leading Nazi scientists are being recruited, not any longer Jews, but leading Nazi scientists are being recruited. And they're initially, and this is kind of the local part of my talk right now, they initially are brought to El Paso in Texas. And so this little picture there, those are actually classes that are held in El Paso where these German Nazi scientists and their families are acclimated, to Texas, and they learn English and so on and so forth. Amongst them was also no one less than Werner von Braun, who became famous for the development of NASA in Alabama and for the space rocket program, but whose first claim to fame was actually the development of rockets for Hitler and his involvement of the building of these rockets in one of the concentration camps. So some of these make it seamlessly across. I want us now to focus, though, on a few of the local kind of heroes from around Texas, because when we normally talk about this, it becomes a story about Princeton, Albert Einstein, UPenn, and universities like that. But there are a good many individuals, like this one, Dr. Andras Lako, who arrived also from Budapest, eventually in North Texas, and taught for many years at the university there just north of us as a professor. Want to go to some stories that are a little closer to home. Wolfgang Rindler, one of our professors at UT Dallas, He escaped as one of the children on the so-called Kindertransport. In 1939, Jewish families sent their kids abroad to England as a last, resort to safeguard them. He's one of those children, ends up ultimately being recruited to UT Dallas and teaches there for many years math. Here's another one, Hans Mark, who will become not at UT Dallas in Dallas, but rather in Austin, and a famous professor. And then I have, this is my American example. Now I want to quickly look at Mexico, and then we want to, Marta, right? We want to talk, right? You want me to get there. So I want to look quickly at Mexico. The story thus far has been entirely about North America, not about Mexico. Well, that has something to do with the, comparatively speaking, smaller number of Jews. It's a tiny community. Mexico is also not particularly welcoming to Jewish refugees. Mexico was more welcoming to German refugees who were on the political left, right? This is the more famous story that many of the German socialists and communists escaped Nazi Germany and found temporary home in Mexico rather than Jews. But there are a couple that I find are interesting that I just want to emphasize here. Ooh, that was too quick. Hannes Meyer. Hannes Meyer is the second director of the famous Bauhaus. Bauhaus is this famous endeavor of creating new functional designs. The reason why everything looks here so cool, as well as in many other places, it's a distant kind of echo of Bauhaus design, beautiful functionality. That's in lots of ways what you see around here. He's the second director of Bauhaus, who then, however, gets ousted because of his political orientation, goes into the Soviet Union, then to Switzerland, and then comes to Mexico. And it's in Mexico where he is collaborating with a good many artists, in particular in graphical design. And some of the things that he becomes famous for is in particular bringing now this Bauhaus aesthetics to the depiction of pre-Columbian art and cultures of Mexico. But then also obviously because of the publication of this famous book, the Black Book of Nazi Terror in Europe, that appears in Mexico City. He's the designer of this book and of the cover. This is kind of a collaboration of various German refugees in Mexico who are writing about what the Third Reich and what Hitler actually means. And then there's this later documentation of his ongoing work together with others, the Workshop for Popular Graphic Art, a record of 12 years of collective work. And again, it's this interesting meshing of Mexican art with Bauhaus art that you see kind of coming together in the graphic art here. But I want to focus, last but not least, because it has been all about men, now on a couple of women that are really not properly ever refugees, but that end up temporarily in Mexico. And this is in particular a field which is interesting because it was dominated by women during the 1920s, photography. So while scientists was a very male-dominated clientele, photography was far less. Photography was a newly emerging field, new technology. In many ways, really the thing that marks this period is the creation of the Leica camera. This is the 1927, the fast little camera that it's almost like our iPhone, little and can go anywhere. That's the tool that many women use to create new types of photography, and amongst them is Gisela Freund, who makes a name early on, goes into exile, is in Argentina, and is so successful with her photos of Eva Perón that she's making, however, decked out with rings and diamonds, that it causes such a scandal because of the austerity that is, allegedly part of the Perón regime. You can't have her like decked out and all blitz and glitz, that Gisela is in need of a new home and ends up in Mexico, where she makes, you see some of these photos. Sorry, I skipped this on the top part. she makes a whole run of really interesting photos of Diego Rivera and of Frida Kahlo, which are really interesting because they're these intimate portraits of her. She's not the only one. Along with her is Ellen Auerbach, another one of these widely celebrated women of the Weimar Republic. Her claim to fame is really advertisement and fashion photography during the Weimar Republic, really innovative. She becomes itinerant and constantly in search of a new home, goes to Palestine, goes to England, goes to America, is constantly moving around. But after the war, returns repeatedly to Mexico, where she makes these larger circle of photos and becomes again really infatuated with native Indians in particular in Mexico. Her book itself, which she wants to publish, doesn't get published right at that time, but far later, but it's another one of these famous artists. And then last but not least, the couple, Joseph and Annie Albers, also rotating around the world, trying to find a new home, teaching in the United States, but then making all in all 30 and then some trips to Mexico, where they become the ones who document really pre-Columbian art. So in many ways, there are more faces to Albert Einstein than just his science. There's also this really interesting exile group of German artists, amongst whom there will be not just men, but also women, depending on the particular areas that we're looking at. But I think those women in particular, or those artists, and I've just used some of those simpler examples right now, leave as much an imprint upon our cultures as the scientific community has in their own ways. And I think that brings me to my end, and almost within 30 minutes, right? All right, let's go. Yes, I shall join you.
Well, it has been a great trip to listen to you and to understand what you want us to. Okay.
On.
So I'm just going to give the word. If anyone has a question, I can say it here. So you say it there, and then I can repeat it so that it is recorded. And if the people listening to us want to make a question, we have here people that can bring the questions to us. To me, what I heard, what was new, is this idea of the Operation Paperclip. I didn't understand. What do you mean about Nazi scientists being brought to the United States? I am surprised.
So by 45, when Nazi Germany is being defeated, you would have thought that this is still the enemy. But the Americans are very quick to figure out that amongst the Nazis are also still a number of noticeable scientists. And Werner von Braun is one of those. And he, together with others, are given rights to enter into the United States as part of this Operation Paperclip. And they become particularly critical in the development of rockets. And Werner von Braun becomes really, to this day, a venerated, celebrated individual in Alabama and with NASA, because he's one of the critical figures who really creates that space program. So it's a really, lately, bit of more of a story that has attracted a lot of attention. Why is it that all these Nazi scientists end up in the United States? And it creates a kind of, the other side of that coin of how many Jews possibly could have survived the Holocaust if they would have been allowed into the United States in the 30s. So if you just think, on the one side you have Werner von Braun, and on the other side you have the family of Anne Frank, Otto Frank, constantly writing and trying to get into the United States, but to no avail, then those make two interesting different sides of the same kind of questions of who's allowed in and who's not allowed in, usefulness.
Right, but just to concentrate on these Nazis, so we're assuming that people that were at good positions, let's say, in the Nazi regime were not all prosecuted.
No,
No.
some of them famously were prosecuted, obviously, in the trial of Nuremberg,
Yeah.
at Nuremberg, but not all of them. Some were deemed really, really useful. And insofar as they were useful, then they were successful also in creating this idea that they were not responsible. So this goes back to this image that I showed earlier of the Third Reich. When Hitler, Germany is defeated, we have that idea that this is a regime which is very hierarchical, right? There's one really powerful dictator on top, and everyone else is more or less forced into following whatever they need to follow, which means they're not really responsible for the action. And so that's also how some of these Nazi scientists can explain their respective role, that they didn't know about the Holocaust, that they were far away from it, that they were just following orders. And so that's, in it's our understanding nowadays of the Third Reich has changed. It's not any longer that we think it depended just on one powerful dictator, but we understand that dictatorship relies on each one of us being willing to go along with it. But in 45, we had a very simplified, sense of what dictatorship meant.
So you mean that now it will be more complex to accept them?
Yeah, no, I think nowadays it would be far more complicated for us to accept, and we have a far better understanding that, you have to remember, when Hitler comes to power, he has little over 40% of the votes. He doesn't have the biggest majority, so lots of ways it takes a lot of effort to get every German behind this. And Germans have choices along the way, and are willing to become ultimately. But that's something we are nowadays probably more willing to see.
Yeah, and the situations probably have changed dramatically with the communication, because one of the things that one has to consider at that time is really the lack of communication, the lack of true knowledge of what was going on, because there was no television, nothing that you could really understand, like when you say yes to working for the Nazis and at a local township, how does that affect to the big picture? Nowadays, it is clear, but at the time it was difficult, I imagine.
Well, it's an interesting question. So we're here at a university. So let's say, for argument's sake, most of the students, to do simple math, they're about 20 years old, right? So that means if we try to do simple math, nothing too complicated. So if we say in 33, the students at the time were 20, that means that they would have been born in 1913. They would have, just about finished high school, and then the better part of their life, they would have known only one reality, and that's the reality of the Third Reich. I don't want to make comparison, but I don't know how much it is in the Mexican press, but the American press loves right now stories about the resistance, the opposition to Putin, right? It's filled, every story about the demonstrations, this and that.
Analogously, we could imagine that if you are born in the Russia of Putin, you have no idea
in other words, what I'm trying to get at is we have today far better communication, but it doesn't mean that we always have better information. Correct. Those are two different things, and we're very well aware of how much our new social media, if anything, has served, also in the United States. Not just the spread of news and truth, but also all kinds of other things. So I think that's, what we have to understand. The Third Reich lasts from 33 to 45. There's a whole generation in there that doesn't know anything else.
Correct. And what you are saying is that to put moral blame into people that have no choices is difficult.
It's difficult. You're interested in ethics, right?
Correct.
So that's why you're asking me that. But it's also, we often, I think, we simplify this from a historical perspective. We look at these people and we think, why didn't they? And when we ask that question, we think that they were clearly at some point at this moment where they looked to the left, I could do this, or look right and I could do that. And the truth is that the reality was always far more complex, because they ended up taken small steps, maybe in one direction, because they thought, you know what, I'm not going to oppose this because my son is finishing this year as high school. Why should I go to a school and talk to them about the stupid Nazi ideology? I'm just going to be quiet. Next thing, the neighbors are gone. Well, there are also all the other people that they know, and so they're going to be quiet again. And so I think our moral compass gets lost, usually not by us making these dramatic decisions. Do I want to be good or do I want to be bad, right? I mean, nobody consciously makes that choice.
Correct. Yeah.
Oh, I should hope not. But more often we lose our footing in small increments, and then we end up in situations that we would have never anticipated early on.
Yeah. Well, another sort of questions is, are you just wanting to share with us these two interests on scientists and artists for some reason? Do you is this your specialty, scientists and artists, or you just wanted to share that with us? Or why did you choose those two?
This is not my specialty. I do think that the issue of refugees is a really relevant one these days. I mean, you and I talked earlier about the Ukraine, the numbers of homeless or displaced people is steadily rising. We're going to continuously face now larger numbers of people either being displaced by war and conflict or by environment or economic hardship. And I think we have to start changing our ways of how we think about refugees. The refugees are in many ways, these are extreme examples,
Correct.
But in lots of ways, they open your eyes to the fact that the history of refugees is more complex, and that in many ways they are becoming not just contributors to your society, but they bring a certain know-how to your society that you may not have had. Be that graphic, art or scientific knowledge or whatever it is. So that's more why I think sometimes the history of refugees from the Third Reich is helpful. Also because we are, often, thinking, for example, about the United States as always having been this place of great welcome. Well, not always, There have been times when the United States was a country of immigrants and was built around this idea of the great melting pot, but it also has had times when it embraced rather the opposite, very restrictive laws. And I think right now, we are more probably less with the welcoming part, or maybe we're coming in closer to it again, but particularly under Trump, we were in an era which was most restrictive. A lot of the violence that we're seeing right now in the United States that is enacted by what's called white supremacists, it's all built around this fear of immigrants and that are quote unquote replacing us. And I think that's why in lots of ways, I thought this was a timely topic.
So you are saying that refugees have helped creating a better society in many ways, and therefore we should realize that when we put immigrants as excuses, is often the result of just mere xenophobia. So
that, I think, is a good way of putting it. Look at Germany. Germany, had an interesting case. Germany has this history of the Second World War, of the Holocaust, of war behind it. And so in 2015-16, Germany accepted record numbers of Syrian refugees. Right? Very famously, it was like learning from the past, right? Really. But it's that influx of Syrian refugees that then polarized the German society to an extent that gave more voice to the radical right again, that became really quite a challenge. And it's only now that politically Germany has swung back again and kind of pulled back from the radical right. So it's in lots of ways, it's an ongoing struggle that our societies have, where I think at the center of it is also, who are we? What does it mean to be Mexican? What does it mean to be American? Or what does it mean to be German? Whenever we say I'm German, what does that mean? I always like to think that it means that we all play soccer very well, but that's probably not the case any longer. Not after the last World Cup anyway. But we usually have something in our minds, right? We have some image that we filled it with. And that image usually means that we're excluding others from it.
And also it has to do with a historical understanding, because if you just push backwards, well, what was the United States in I don't know, 1500s, right? There was no Europeans there.
Right.
So it depends on when do you put the date to consider what is to be an American, or
No, very true.
or Germany. What was Germany in certain centuries? It was just different empires going forward and backwards.
No, but you asked me earlier about the Third Reich, right?
Yeah.
And we'll do a comparison to Putin and the likes. So, many ways, the Third Reich comes after the First and the Second Reich, right? 1, 2, 3. And it really is, from the perspective of Hitler, an attempt to create something that finally fulfills, quote unquote, Germany's destiny that had been created out of the Holy Roman Empire, which was the First Reich. So it really is a long historical arc, right? So that's why he thinks that he's finally completing something that, if you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, the German tribes, that began with them and ideally, was supposed to be completed with Hitler. While Putin is equally, captured by the past. He wants to recreate the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire as it existed up until 1914. And in many ways, the idea of attacking the Ukraine is an attempt to kind of bring the old Russia back again. And in many ways, they too have something else in common. We didn't quite get into the history of the Holocaust, but we can ask ourselves, I said 1941 earlier. So what happens in 1941? In 1941, Germany, or the Third Reich, attacks the Soviet Union and thinks that they can very quickly defeat Russia. It doesn't turn out that way. And when they realize that it doesn't turn out that way, their war descends very quickly into genocide and then eventually into the Holocaust. Now move forward to Putin. Putin attacks the Ukraine and thinks that he has a very quick and decisive victory on his hand. And when that doesn't quite turn out, you've seen the pictures that have made us all realize that what Russia is fighting in the Ukraine is not a normal war any longer. It's also a war against civilians, it's a war against women, it's a war against children. So we see this radicalization of violence, which is almost impossible for us to fathom right now, that it could still happen again in front of our very own eyes.
Frightening. So
it is.
So but what are you saying? Like the emotions of a dictator is you have this expectation of becoming a war hero, and then you have more difficulties, and therefore you become cruel.
There's no way back into this.
Right.
So
you cannot accept defeat.
You can't, on the one side, position yourself as a savior and the redeemer of a country, whether it's Germany or Russia, and then on the other side, 4 weeks in, say, didn't work out so well. With that rhetoric, there's really hard to walk it back. But Hannah Arendt, if we want to talk about philosophers, she has a really interesting essay on violence. And in that essay, she makes a really interesting point that violence occurs when power disintegrates. That, power is in and of itself not good or bad, but when power disintegrates in regimes, there's usually a disintegration that comes then along with, this kind of unrestrained violence. And that's, I think, what we see right now in the Ukraine, and that's in lots of ways also the story of part with the Holocaust.
Now, if we go back to what you do in the Ackerman Institute Center, do you have different venues to make this available, known into people? And especially, I'm just thinking about in Mexico, what are your links to Mexican organizations that study also Jewish? And why just Jewish? I mean, why not all refugees?
So there are a couple of things. You asked 4 or 5 questions, so I'll take one at a time. So what do I do at the Ackerman Center? So for starters, I think I've been at the university now a little over 15 years. And when you grow up in Germany, the Holocaust matters in very particular ways, right? That makes sense. From a perspective of Germany, you think about it in one way. But then when I came to the United States and to Dallas, I all of a sudden was in a classroom where often we had students from 4 different continents and from endless number of different languages and cultural backgrounds. So for them, this becomes a very different story than it would have been for me. So part of it is really realizing that the Holocaust is significant, not just because it tells us something about what the Germans did to the Jews, but I think it tells us a larger story about humanity and what we're capable of for good and for bad. And that, I think, appeals to students from all kinds of backgrounds. So in lots of ways, therefore, this program, while maybe specifically focused initially on the Holocaust, speaks actually to a far wider audience. The other one is, over the years, this was the vision of the founders of our Holocaust survivor. Over 2-3 years ago, we changed our mission from being just about the Holocaust to being also about genocides and other human rights violations. So in lots of ways, we have widened it, and we're therefore happy to hire also Dr. Gonzalez, who teaches actually a lot on human rights violations classes in Mexico City, then Mexico and Latin America in general. Our connections, it's an interesting one. Again, location. You asked me earlier how the flight was, and I said, well, it's from Dallas to Monterey. Takes me less time than from Dallas to, let's say, Denver. So yes, there's a border, but in many ways we're neighbors, right? We're almost butting exactly against each other. So for us, I think it makes a lot of sense to create relationships, not just with institutions north of us, but with institutions south of us. And so therefore, I mean, again, thanks to Dr. Gonzalez, we have relationships with the Holocaust Museum in Guatemala, in Mexico City, and Buenos Aires. You can speak a little bit more about this. I mean, this is what he spearheads, and we're eager to partner up with Tec de Monterrey, not just on Holocaust, but also on the wider scale in terms of the humanity. Because my other role is that I'm actually the dean of the School of Arts and Humanities, and so in that role, I'm here.
Well, I don't know if there is any question from the audience that, yeah?
Do you need a mic?
I'll repeat it if you want.
Thank you. I'm surprised that the United States did not, in Mexico, did not allow refugees to enter the country. And I always thought that they were always open. And why, I mean, I understand that at the Great Depression, there was not a lot of jobs, and maybe they did that to protect American jobs. But like afterwards, what happened to the US or Mexico that they did not allow Jews? Was it because of economic reasons, or because they didn't want to befriend Germany or Hitler? What happened?
So, just maybe 1924, when the US is instituting these more restrictive immigration laws, these laws are not just simply reducing the total number of immigrants allowed in, but they institute a hierarchy of more useful and less useful immigrants. And that's based on a racial classification. So your ability to enter if you are Northern European was slightly higher than if you would have been from the South or something like that. So in other words, this issue already during the 1920s becomes highly racialized. During the 1930s, the US is not just suffering the depression and all that, but also is experiencing a height of anti-Semitism, which is really very important to all of this. And it's probably also one of the reasons why, in particular, its various offices, in particular the State Department, tried to be as restrictive as they possibly could be when it came to Jewish refugees. So they're quite deliberate in terms of trying to limit the numbers. And
how was the anti-Semitism felt?
So give you a famous example, Ford. Henry Ford, right? You think about him in terms of cars, one of the most adamant anti-Semites that brought the whole prestige I mean, Ford was the American icon, right? This is the American dream, the productivity, the innovation, and also the most adamant anti-Semite. He becomes the translator of one of the most notorious anti-Semitic texts called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that he translates and publishes in his own newspaper that every car dealership has to buy in order to sell Ford cars. So this is really virulent. Then you have another famous example.
This is in what year?
This is in the 1920s.
The 1920s.
Then during the 1930s, anti-Semitism takes to the waves. You have anti-Semitic sermons on the radio. Father Kaufman is an outspoken example. There's a reason why in 1938, so many Americans opposed the idea of immigrants, because of that reluctance or hostility, or however you want to call it. Why is it that virtually every Hollywood star in the 1930s changes their names to make it less noticeable that they are Jewish? So anti-Semitism is a real important part. Once you enter the war, then there becomes also the additional problem for the United States, and that is that the United States, Roosevelt, is really very clear about wanting to make sure that the US fights the war to defeat Nazi Germany, not to liberate Jews, because there's a sense that the Americans are supportive of the first goal, to defeat Nazi Germany, but if they were to think that their own soldiers are put in danger in order to save Jews, that then the support for the war could break. One of the ways how you could see this is in the New York Times. The New York Times will barely ever report on the Holocaust, and when it does report on victims, it will refer to them more by their nationality. Polish victims, Ukrainian victims, French victims, but never early on as Jewish victims. So there is really this lingering reluctance, and this reluctance holds on, sorry, this is a long answer, all the way to 48, 49. It's only in 49 when the US finally allows the remnant of survivors, the so-called displaced persons, to enter the United States. Up until then, between 45 and 48, 49, there are a substantial number of Jews who are in camps under American control in Germany, who are kind of in a waiting, where are we allowed to go? The British don't allow them to go to Palestine because they still have the mandate, and the Americans don't allow them to come to the United States. So this reluctance in lots of ways, unfortunately, therefore, goes on. Mexico, this is not my field of expertise, but like I was trying to say earlier, is more welcoming to Germans on the political left, in particular since you had a socialist-leaning government during the 1930s, and less to Jews. And then there's one other interesting story in all of this. When the United States enters the war, after Pearl Harbor, they, for a moment, long-lasting moment, have this fear that the German immigrants that had come earlier to Latin America, to Guatemala, to Mexico, that could be, all secretly could be spies and Nazis.
So there is a lot of anti-Germans in the United States.
So you have that as well. And the United States will then exert a tremendous amount of pressure on Latin American countries, including Mexico, to deport their Germans to the United States. And we have in Texas, during the 1940s, some of these camps that host Germans from Guatemala and from Mexico who were deported. So that's the other kind of crazy side to all of that.
Yeah, a lot to learn about history and the little stories that are often unknown. I just would like to go back to this desire of opening our minds to the problem of the refugees and the fact that we need to understand that migration is happening and how we should consider something positive about this migration. Can you tell us more about how are we to think, because there are throngs of refugees at the moment, so more and more there will be climatic refugees, people moving to search for better. So one is at the personal level, what we are supposed to do, and then as public policies. What are we to do with migrations?
Well,
What do
I'm
you think?
glad that we're coming to the small questions now, right?
Yes.
So I think the climate is an interesting one. So one of the forecasts is that we're going to have more and more climate refugees. And climate, in lots of ways, is one of those issues that scales all the way down to what you do individually, to what your community, your country, your continent, and then us globally do. So in lots of ways, it's really one where we all, quite literally, on any given day,
Responsible.
have a certain responsible and can kind of embrace this one or not, right? So it's many other big issues, like take the Ukraine. So what are your choices? So how can you influence the Russian-Ukrainian war? Well, you might feel, okay, you can make donations or can do this or that, but it's harder to see how you as an individual have a way of influencing this. Environment, I think, is really one that scales in many ways. So if we feel, therefore, our responsibility, then I think the first ought to be to kind of embrace that responsibility so that we are not contributing to greater loss of home and dislocation of people. So that would be the kind of taking on our more global responsibility that we have. The other one, and you could see how this sometimes works and how it doesn't work, to be more welcoming to refugees. I mean, I use Germany as an example with the Syrian refugee, prime example of a welcoming policy, which, however, really undermined Merkel at the time, the German chancellor, because it was politically almost impossible to sustain. You could see how now, because there's a commitment to fight Putin, then there's also a commitment toward the Ukrainian refugees. And there, I think, is an interesting discussion. Why are we so much more welcoming to Ukrainian refugees than we would have been to Syrian refugees?
Haitians. We have hundreds of people from Haiti.
Yeah. So
And in Monterrey, all wanting to go to the United States, but it is more difficult for them to
enter the United States,
than
yes.
Ukrainians. Yeah.
But I think what I'm trying to get at is we seem to, so take me, for example. I don't think I register in the United States the same manner for most people than people from other countries. So in lots of ways, Germans have always been welcome in the United States. There's always been an influx of Germans. I don't think I register as being a cultural threat or something like that to people on the radical right. But they have a particular view of who is desirable and who is less desirable. And I think that's a conversation that we have to have in our communities, that we have to get away from the sense that the people of a country have to make up a kind of one ethnicity. I mean, again, take Mexico. Mexico is not that homogenous. There's not one community. Germany, if you nowadays go to Germany, Germany is not one community any longer. It's not that homogenous. We have high percentages of people who either have come from elsewhere or who are the children of immigrants. So I think that's part of our new reality. And I think the problem is that we're still hanging on to these national identities as if they exist anywhere other than in our, ideals of the past or something like that. It's not, we celebrate at UT Dallas the fact that we have students from 100 different countries. You're here from Switzerland. You came sorry to single you out. You came all the way across. I mean, this is far more part of our modern experience of people moving and mobility and of change and of ideas, which I think is something that we need to celebrate more instead of thinking always about it undermining some kind of ideal of one's own identity.
Let's go to the small question now about public policy. Should there be a limit of or ways of preventing undocumented immigrants?
You mean in the United States?
No, I mean everywhere. Well, here we have our reality is in our borders from Chiapas all the way here. Africans that go to Brazil and start walking all the way to Tijuana or to Texas, the border of Texas. So we are having here, Mexico is a place where immigrants pass by, but also is a a destiny for many migrants from South America, Central America. So should there be a limit? How are we to think? Are we to have always open borders? What do you think?
What do you think?
You are the speaker.
Well, you go first.
Well, I think that many things have to be considered. I agree that in a personal way, there's always human dignity to respect. There's never to be violence or aggression, but that there should be a way of ordering the transit. And so many institutions need to be instituted or put together and try to figure out what are we going to do, because the reality is that more and more towns are going to be wiped out because of floods or desertification. So we need to think.
The environment again.
Yeah, well, but not only that. I mean, people move because they want to better their lives economically or fleeing violence. So we are supposed to try to work in their own place to prevent those situations, the violence or whatever we can do in their origins, in their countries. But once they are moving, what are we to do?
Well, I think, the question of the kind of causes for migration are interesting ones. So yes, we sometimes think they want to seek better lives for themselves. And that's in lots of ways very understandable, that people want to better their lives. They want to have better opportunities. They want to be in places that they're safe, where their children are safe, and so on and so forth. So we have to probably work a little bit collectively on the causes that create these constant migrants. But I think, states with borders will insist also on process, and they will want to control the flow, at least, of people as much as they can. Now, that has never been really successful. I mean, that's not really a winning strategy, because in lots of ways, Mexico is a big country with long borders. If your strategy is to control, the borders, I mean, this is an obsession on the other side, right? I mean, the wall building and all of that. I mean, that is not a winning strategy. If you invest all of your energy into controlling your borders, there are way too many ways these days for migrants, if they choose to do so.
So what alternatives are there?
I think we rather have to find ways to work with them. And, take the Ukraine as a good example. There are millions of Ukrainians that fled in the immediate outbreak of the war, but there are also many that are returning now again. Because in lots of ways, people are not necessarily always desiring to leave their home behind. They rather want to actually stay put where they are, where they speak the language, where their parents are, where they grew up, and so on and so forth. So I think our efforts should be a little bit more directed at helping them also to stay where they are and making that life there a little bit more sustainable. Because the controlling of the border, I think, Europe has had its try at this one, and it doesn't work so well.
But they are trying. I mean, Boris Johnson just made this incredible law in the UK, so that when people arrive there, they are sent to Rwanda.
Yes.
So people are putting public policies that are very strict, because Italy feels swamped, Spain.
No, Italy has a good, but that's interesting. So Italy has a good point of feeling that they're dealing with numbers that they cannot cope any longer with.
So the other countries claim the same. The UK feels the same. Spain feels the same.
Well, UK has luckily or not exited the European community. But one of the things that's really was difficult with the Syrian refugees already to institute within Europe is collective responsibility. Because if you look at the distribution of refugees in Europe, that's really uneven. It's not that all countries are accepting in even numbers, but then they also can't really accept in even numbers, because obviously the economy is behind, whatever. Belgium is a little bit different than, let's say, France or Germany. But to institute like a European policy in terms of the distribution of refugees, that I think is something that, they've tried, but it hasn't worked so well. And so Italy is therefore suffering a lot of it.
Yeah, but Germany has had also this situation with Turkey. with so many immigrants.
Yeah, but that's different because so there are so I could make so why are so if you are at a very fine university, but if you wanted to study elsewhere, you could think about the UK, and that would be really, really expensive. You could think about the United States, that would also be really expensive, but you could study in Germany. Germany is welcoming. It's a state university system. You pay virtually nothing and you get a fine education. Why? Because Germany has figured out that most of you would stay on in Germany and become highly productive citizens and would help the German economy, because the German population is declining, and therefore there has been a constant influx. And that started with migrants from Italy and from Turkey, who helped actually what was the big economic boom of the post-war period, which is called Germany's economic miracle. But Germany's economic miracle, from total destruction in 1945 to being one of the economic powerhouses of Europe, didn't just happen overnight. It happened because of the migrants and cheap labor, and because of the United States support financially. But it's a perfect example. We're not dealing with Turkish immigrants right now. We're dealing with their children and grandchildren right now. They are, in many ways, and this is what people get confused when they talk about Turkish immigrants, they're German citizens. Most of them are German citizens by now. They're not.
How about the religion? I was
how
just
about the religion?
Just also, this relates to the fact that when you spoke about so many Jewish people being part of the scientific scene, most of them were not religious Jewish. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So how does religion play a role in the whole situation that you study?
In the Third Reich?
Well, in terms of the rejection of immigrants, for instance, against Muslims in France or in Germany, and with Jewish was not the case, because most of them were not very religious.
Well, this is interesting. So, Jews had been part of German communities for a long, long period of time, and they had in many ways been really, really integrated, but they identified themselves as German, who were of Jewish faith. And however religious observant there were or not, was a wide range. Some of them intermarried, some even converted to Protestantism or to Catholic Church. But when 1933 came around, they were redefined by racial categorizations, not any longer the ways how they identified by themselves or how maybe the church even would have recognized them, but by racial laws. So the racial laws of 1935, for example, are significant because they don't recognize any longer baptism as something that is significant. So from a Christian perspective, baptism is transformative. You become something new, not from the perspective of race. So the question then is, for us in our discussions, how does religion always relate or map onto race? And I think that's where the Nazis were in particular moving from religious definitions to racial definitions. And I think we are doing this again, where we are presupposing that there is something that we call the Muslims, which is internally a tremendously heterogeneous community that is very global. And we are pitting it against the community of what? The Christians. Most of the Christians actually don't live in Europe any longer, but they live outside of Europe. So we're really throwing around, I mean, this is a part with the Syrian refugees, right? That Poland and other countries said, well, we cannot welcome them into this, our Christian community. But what they meant by that was not just simply a religious, but also a political, national, and also a racial community. And I think that's where, we are really, to this day, we have problems differentiating religious, identities from racial identities.
So you mean that it is an excuse to bring up the religion?
Yes. Well, it's not an excuse. I think religion is often used because it seems easier than to speak about
justifies
race.
Your racism already somehow. Okay. Well, I don't know if there is another question.
Yes.
I would like to go back to to some of the points that you made that are interesting and new to me.
I'm very interested in like anti-Semitism, but like modern anti-Semitism. And I know like in the US, there's an issue in college campuses or like in high schools of a lot of anti-Semitic attacks. However, do you think maybe lack of education or lack of knowledge is one of the sources of this like new wave of anti-Semitism? Because I know like in the US, it's not mandatory for every state to teach about the Holocaust in young students, but I don't know like if there's a strong relation between that.
So this is a really two-layered question. The one is about modern anti-Semitism and how it manifests itself today, and the other one is how it is related or not related to Holocaust education. The stunning, let me answer the second question maybe first. If you nowadays go into the United States, take Texas, we have a mandate to teach Holocaust in middle schools. Texas itself has 4 Holocaust museums in San Antonio, in El Paso, in Houston, and in Dallas. Significant museums. It has its center, it has its genocide centers and others. So there's more Holocaust education available than ever. If in addition you go by movies and TV, there's never been as much as there has been in the last 20 years. Yet, when you look at polls where teenagers and others have been asked, name a concentration camp or name the number of Jewish victims, their historical knowledge is abysmal. I mean, it's really terrible, worse than it ever has been. So my conclusion from that is there's a bigger problem, not just about Holocaust education, but about education. That in lots of ways we're missing really, something is not quite right. For all intents and purposes, they should know far more than they actually do. Because we have record numbers of attendance. Our local Holocaust Museum in Dallas, I think has about 70,000 visitors a year, and those are mainly middle schoolers. So those are big numbers. They should be about as smart as I am on this, right? They should know virtually everything, but they don't. So maybe the bigger issue is education, big issue is how we consume information, and that's a bigger conversation, I think. Anti-Semitism. I think the big problem that we have again these days is, if, in Charlottesville a couple of years ago, the radical right demonstrated they will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Then they had this category of the Jews again. And for them, this meant every American Jew, every European Jew, but also every Jew in Israel. And I think a lot of the conflicts on campuses these days have a lot to do with the Middle Eastern conflict and are fueled in many ways by that, because our campuses are also really diverse campuses. UT Dallas, we have a big Middle Eastern community on campus. Rightly look at this from a slightly different perspective of also wanting to see there's some acknowledgement about the victimhood of Palestinians. You have the whole politicization that came in particular out of the UK of trying to divest any kind of relationships with the state of Israel, with Israeli universities. But I think that all really works only insofar as you think that there is something that allows you to lump everyone together as Jews, just as much as you could. If you ask me a silly question about Germany, then I will remind you that I'm not responsible for the German government. I'm not responsible for what all Germans are doing. Neither is the Jewish student on our campus responsible for what happens in Israel, or a Russian student for Putin. And I think that's, again, works only insofar as we think race is actually something that exists and not fantasy of a racist. If we understand that racism, by scientifically speaking, by 99.9%, we are all identical, right? There is not like this big DNA change that, you're built in a different way than I am. We have more in common than not. It's just race that presupposes that there are sharp differences between us, because race exists by being mapped onto other differences, religion, social economic differences, linguistic or languages, and so on and so forth. So for us, on our campuses, it's a big problem. Not, luckily, you knock on wood there.
Knock on wood.
Luckily not at UT Dallas. We have had no problems with that. But we're, really interested right now in building, if you come to visit us, around us, there are about as many big churches as there are synagogues as there are mosques. And so one of our challenges is really to understand that we are the University of Texas at Dallas, a public institution that needs to have open relationships with all these communities. And so that's what we're working on right now. But it's, I think, gets politicized. Sorry, this was a slightly longer answer. You still had some funny notes there.
Well, no, it is related to this idea about Dallas and the universities. You mentioned this issue, which I thought it was very interesting, about how some scientists were to be brought in the coasts, and they enter the universities of the coasts, west and east.
Schools, yeah.
How did that happen, and what does that mean for the middle of the United States universities?
So there's a bigger history again about the universities, and we're returning to this again of sorts. Harvard is in the 1920s at the forefront of essentially instituting a restriction on Jewish students and trying really to limit that. So there's a long history of that. And this reaches well into the post-war period, that when it comes to these institutions, they have very clearly defined hierarchies. But these Nobel Prize winners and other really significant scientists present an exception, and they're welcome, but they're welcome in the Ivy League institutions. And so this organization matches up, these scientists with these Ivy League institutions, but they don't think that they have a place in the University of Alabama or the University of Knoxville or something like that, because there's a very clear north-south hierarchy. That the Ivy League schools are north and on the East Coast and on the West Coast, and not in the South. Now, when the post-war period comes around, it's interesting that then again, many American Jews struggle making it into, let's say, the more famous medical schools, because there's again this restriction, and you'll find more Jews attending than the University of Kentucky, or getting their degrees like that. So in lots of ways, the American university system is in many ways a wonderful university system. It has lots of claims to fame, but it has not ever been entirely removed from these kind of racial politics neither, of inclusion and exclusion.
And what has happened positively or negatively with this fact that they did have these refugees? So do you want to say?
There are studies, in chemistry, for example, you can chronicle how with the influx of Jewish chemists, the number of patents, rose sharply up that were granted for in the United States. In our case, our university, I used local examples. We had a wonderful faculty that became the kind of creators of our math program. And it was a group of Jews and other immigrants who came from Hungary and from Germany and other places who created that initial program dedicated to math. So in lots of ways, they created part of also of the university's systems. You have similar stories if you go beyond, Germany or the United States. German scientists are really important refugee scientists in the development of the Turkish university system, because they are also going into that direction. So there's a very positive and very lasting impact to them. That's why this one book that I mentioned was Hitler's Gift, that in lots of ways, Hitler's racial politics benefit many surrounding countries who end up being the new home for many of these scientists.
Yeah, and nowadays, universities do try to be as open to, let's say, to have a variety in the professors.
Well, because we understand now, not just variety of professors, but we understand that being a university is a competitive business, And that in lots of ways, it's to the benefit of the students and their educational experience of being in a more global student body. We don't think it's beneficial for them any longer to go to a university where everyone is exactly like them. But if we want to attract them, then the faculty can also not be all the same. So, big issue, for example, in American universities, my university, my schools, is diversity of faculty. How can we attract global students from everywhere if all of us are white male, for example? Not that we all are, but we're still a little bit in that pocket, right? So we have to change ourselves if we want to stay relevant to this new incoming cohort of students who are now 18 or 19, who have very diverse educational and cultural backgrounds, and who will not think about the University of Texas at Dallas as a possibility unless we also look a little bit like the 21st century. As long as we look like some fantasy of some nationalist, from the 1980s, then we are really outdated and not relevant any longer. So I think it's the right thing to do, but I think it's also a necessity, quite honestly.
So maybe this is a great way of ending our talk, understanding that probably from the point of view of diversity, inclusion is the best way of understanding the problem of refugees.
That is a very good way of ending. Thank you.
Thank you very much.